In August 1973, grocery store meat counters across the United States sat completely empty. Glass display cases were draped in brown paper, while handwritten signs urged frustrated shoppers to buy canned fish or peanut butter instead. Across the country, more than 100 meatpacking facilities halted operations and laid off thousands of workers, as millions of families arrived at local markets only to find bare shelves, empty freezer cases, and closed butcher counters. When meat counters went bare, the public narrative blamed corporate greed, hoarding ranchers, and secret industry deals. Yet the sudden absence of beef was not caused by a breakdown in farm production or a sudden natural disaster. It was the direct, predictable result of an artificial disruption in the market pipeline, where cattle simply ceased moving toward the regional processing plants. Fleet trucks carrying live cattle vanished from major highway corridors heading toward Chicago and Omaha. Inside central processing plants, assembly lines built to handle thousands of cattle every day sat completely silent, while regional distribution hubs cleared out their final cold storage vaults. Supply had not vanished from the farms. It was frozen upstream at the very start of the commercial network. The spark that triggered this structural collapse came directly from Washington. In a desperate attempt to curb runaway national inflation, President Richard Nixon announced strict price controls under Phase 3 of his economic stabilization policy, placing an absolute ceiling on retail beef. By fixing the maximum price of meat while ignoring the surging costs of production, the administration created a fatal mathematical trap for livestock producers. For working families struggling against general inflation, government price promises offered brief optimism, but delivered instant disruption. Consumers who lined up early at neighborhood grocery stores were met with total scarcity, forced to confront the harsh reality that executive decrees could not force food onto store shelves when the financial incentives behind production had broken down. As federal officials defended the price ceilings from briefing rooms in the Capitol, financial ledgers across the heartland began turning deep red. The federal government had capped the final retail sale price, but it left the underlying biological and operational mechanics of raising cattle completely exposed to surging market forces. Understanding beef market economics requires recognizing a strict biological timeline. Unlike modern manufacturing plants that can scale assembly lines up or down within days, cattle production operates on an unyielding multi-year growth cycle. From the moment a cow is bred on pasture to the day a finished steer reaches market weight, the biological process takes roughly 2 to 3 years. Because this biological timeline is fixed, cattle raisers must commit millions of dollars in working capital years before knowing what finished beef will sell for at slaughter. Young calves born on open pasture spend their first year grazing on grass before moving into intensive feeding operations. Any sudden shift in policy impacts animals that are already years into their growth investment. Every single phase of this growth curve requires specific nutrition, constant monitoring, and heavy labor investments. Ranchers hold young calves on pasture, track daily weight gain month by month, and calculate the exact feed costs required to transition those herds into commercial feeding pens. When government rules change mid-cycle, it completely distorts the economic math for millions of living animals. By 1973, the traditional model of small pasture-raised herds had been replaced by massive industrial feedlots across Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. These sprawling high plains facilities held tens of thousands of cattle in dense pen arrangements, relying on automated feeding systems and specialized veterinary care to bulk animals up rapidly before shipping them directly to high-capacity packing plants. Independent operators who had invested massive sums of borrowed money into these high-capacity feedlots suddenly found themselves caught in a devastating financial vice. The sheer scale of their daily operations meant that even minor increases in feeding expenses could wipe out decades of built-up farm equity in a matter of weeks. This rapid shift toward industrial scale made the nation's beef supply remarkably efficient. But it also left the system extremely vulnerable to input price shocks. The entire High Plains livestock network depended on a single indispensable feed source, and that primary input was about to experience an unprecedented cost explosion. Feed corn was the high-energy engine driving these modern industrial feedlots. Packed with dense calories, corn enabled facility operators to add hundreds of pounds of muscle and fat to a steer in a fraction of the time required by traditional grass grazing. It was the essential input that converted lean pasture calves into tender choice grade American beef. Because grain costs accounted for up to 70% of a feedlot's total operating budget, the market price of corn directly set the break-even floor for every pound of beef produced. When feed corn remained cheap, feedlots generated reliable profits. If grain prices spiked, every single steer standing in a feeding pen became an escalating daily financial drain. Feedlot managers calculated daily weight gains against the price per bushel of grain delivered by grain trains and commercial trucks. They monitored feed conversion ratios constantly, measuring precisely how many pounds of corn were needed to generate 1 pound of steer gain. This tight ratio meant that any volatility in grain markets echoed instantly across rural feedlots. That fragile balance shattered following an unprecedented international trade decision. In 1972, the Nixon administration quietly completed a massive export agreement, selling over 400 million bushels of American grain to the Soviet Union. Known as the Great Grain Robbery, this heavily subsidized sale drained domestic U.S. grain reserves almost overnight and sent domestic feed corn prices skyrocketing. American feedlot operators watched in shock as local grain elevators emptied and feed prices doubled in a matter of months. The rapid depletion of domestic grain stocks left agricultural communities facing overwhelming feed bills, as Washington trade policies prioritized international diplomacy over the basic operating costs of domestic livestock producers. With feed corn prices surging past historical records, feedlot operators were forced into an impossible financial calculation. The market price of their primary input was climbing without limit on the open market, while federal price controls made it illegal to pass those rising costs along to the retail consumer. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon delivered a televised address that stunned the American financial landscape. Facing mounting public frustration over persistent inflation, Nixon invoked the Economic Stabilization Act of 1970 to execute Phase 1 of his economic strategy. In a single bold move, the White House imposed a mandatory 90-day freeze on all prices and wages across the United States. Across the country, corporate boardrooms and rural auction barns were frozen in place as federal authority superseded free market pricing. While this executive freeze was intended to reset national expectations, it established a rigid federal apparatus to dictate private enterprise. The executive order created the Cost of Living Council, an administrative body tasked with policing compliance across every tier of commerce. For livestock producers, the sudden price ceiling halted immediate price escalation, but it failed to account for the underlying production costs already quietly accumulating throughout the agricultural supply chain. Under the temporary rules of Phase 1, government auditors monitored wholesale and retail transactions to penalize price hikes. Businesses faced federal penalties if they adjusted price tags without approval, creating an artificial pause in retail inflation. Yet this enforcement mechanism focused strictly on finished end products, leaving the complex, multi-year supply chain of livestock production vulnerable to compounding cost imbalances beneath the surface. When Phase 1 expired, the White House transitioned to Phase 2, establishing the Pay Board and the Price Commission to manage long-term price adjustments. Under Phase 2 regulations, industrial corporations could request cost-plus price increases to offset rising manufacturing expenses, but raw agricultural commodities were deliberately exempted from direct caps. Policymakers feared that capping raw farm goods would paralyze rural agricultural operations, creating an immediate systemic imbalance between raw inputs and finished meat products. This regulatory divide forced livestock feeders into an increasingly precarious financial posture. As raw feed grain costs surged without federal caps, feedlot owners watched their operating margins erode while retail processors remained bound by regulated caps. Ranchers and rural feedlot managers felt trapped inside a bureaucratic mechanism that ignored the basic arithmetic of their daily operations, turning routine livestock feeding into a high-stakes gamble. As inflationary pressures continued to build across the broader economy, political advisors urged the White House to dismantle rigid federal controls and restore market flexibility. Washington prepared to pivot away from strict regulation, unaware that easing rules without addressing input costs would accelerate the very crisis they sought to avoid. In January 1973, the Nixon administration launched Phase 3, abruptly dismantling the formal wage and price boards in favor of voluntary compliance guidelines. Washington believed that corporations and labor unions would exercise self-restraint without direct federal intervention. Market participants, however, viewed the shift from mandatory caps to voluntary rules as a clear signal that federal enforcement had softened, prompting immediate and aggressive upward price revisions across wholesale markets. Phase 3 replaced direct regulatory oversight with ambiguous administrative guidelines, creating instant market volatility. Meat processors and grain dealers immediately adjusted their ask prices upward to recoup accumulated input costs from the previous years. Without rigid federal caps to suppress wholesale quotes, the price of agricultural commodities surged, triggering a rapid escalation throughout the food distribution network. Wholesale buyers scrambling for meat supplies began bidding up prices at central stockyards, while packing plants passed those increases along to regional grocery distributors. Because Phase 3 relied on voluntary self-policing rather than active price auditing, commercial distributors operated under the assumption that aggressive price increases were necessary to secure finite livestock inventories before costs climbed higher. The sudden removal of rigid caps caused retail beef prices to jump by over 13% during the first 3 months of 1973 alone. For working-class families already struggling with rising living costs, meat quickly became the defining political symbol of runaway inflation. Grocery bills expanded faster than weekly paychecks, converting a routine household purchase into a source of widespread economic dread. Frustration swept across American suburbs as shoppers confronted escalating price tags at supermarket meat counters every week. Families were forced to alter their daily diets, replacing beef roast with cheaper alternatives or cutting back on meals entirely. The sudden spike in food costs turned everyday shopping trips into tense encounters, instilling a deep sense of powerlessness among millions of working families. This mounting public anger rapidly transformed from quiet frustration into an organized political movement that forced the White House to take notice. As anger spilled over from dinner tables into city halls, consumers across the country prepared to use their purchasing power as a weapon against rising prices. In April 1973, millions of American consumers organized the largest boycott of red meat in the history of the United States. Led by grassroots coalitions of homemakers and community organizers, shoppers across the nation refused to purchase beef, pork, or lamb for an entire week. Supermarket parking lots sat sparse, and meat counters remained stocked but untouched as citizens sought to force prices down through collective consumer power. The meat boycott disrupted the immediate movement of inventory through retail supply chains. Supermarkets saw meat department sales plummet by over 50% in a matter of days, leaving distribution centers crammed with perishable inventory. Grocery chains responded by drastically slashing wholesale orders from meatpacking plants, attempting to push the downward price pressure back up the supply chain to stockyard operators. Packing plants responded to the collapse in retail demand by reducing daily slaughter schedules and temporarily idling processing lines. Livestock trucks lined up outside stockyards as buyers refused to accept live cattle at prevailing market prices. Rather than lowering production costs, the boycott choked off the velocity of cash flow throughout the meat processing infrastructure, leaving live cattle stranded in feedlots. Panicked by the massive political backlash generated by the April boycott, President Nixon acted decisively to suppress consumer anger. On March 29, 1973, in an effort to appease angry voters before the boycott peaked, Nixon announced an executive order imposing a rigid, non-negotiable price ceiling on wholesale and retail beef. Commercial meat sellers were legally forbidden from charging prices above their highest levels established in late March. While suburban consumers celebrated the White House intervention as a victory over rising prices, agricultural producers viewed the executive order with profound dread. Ranchers and feedlot owners realized that federal policy had frozen their top-line revenues at the exact moment their feed costs were accelerating. In rural farming communities across the High Plains, the price ceiling was seen as a devastating betrayal that ignored the brutal economics of livestock production. By freezing finished beef prices at retail counters while leaving feed grain completely uncapped on the open market, Washington unwittingly set the stage for an unprecedented structural disaster. The government had trapped livestock producers between rising feed costs and illegal sale prices, creating a mathematical paradox that would soon bring the entire national meat industry to a complete halt and trigger a severe beef shortage across the nation. The fundamental flaw in the federal price freeze was its glaring economic asymmetry. While retail beef counters were strictly capped by law, the raw grain required to feed livestock remained entirely uncontrolled on open commodity markets. Drought across key growing regions combined with massive grain export deals overseas sent feed corn prices surging past $3 a bushel. Meat packers found themselves caught in a legal trap, strictly prohibited from paying a penny more for live cattle than the retail price cap permitted, while feedlots watched the cost of keeping those animals alive skyrocket overnight. This structural flaw split the agricultural supply chain into two opposing economic realities. Grain traders operated in a free market with rapidly escalating prices, while cattle feeders were bound to a frozen revenue ceiling. Because feed corn accounts for roughly 70% of the total expense of finishing a steer, any surge in grain costs directly burned through the narrow operating margins of feedlots across the country. To track their daily survival, feedlot managers continuously recalculated grain futures against fixed packer bids. With feed corn prices doubling in a matter of months, the daily expense of feeding a single head of cattle far outpaced the maximum purchase price that meatpacking plants were legally permitted to offer upon slaughter. By June 1973, the internal math of cattle feeding had turned completely toxic. Every time a finished steer stepped onto the scale at a High Plains feedlot, the owner stood to lose between $50 and $100 on that single animal upon sale. Delivering livestock to market was no longer an ordinary business transaction. It had transformed into an act of immediate financial self-destruction that threatened to wipe out family farms and commercial operators alike. For independent cattle producers across the heartland, watching their working capital evaporate with every truckload sent to slaughter was a crushing ordeal. Decades of patient breeding and careful financial management were being swept away not by drought or disease, but by mathematical rules written in distant government offices. As these escalating losses pushed operations toward total insolvency, livestock producers across the nation reached a consensus that surviving the summer required an immediate, coordinated rejection of the traditional market timeline. Facing unavoidable ruin, ranchers and feedlot owners made a rational decision grounded in game theory: stop sending cattle to market. Instead of shipping mature animals to slaughterhouses at a guaranteed loss, producers pulled their steers off expensive grain diets and turned them out onto open pasture grass. By reducing grain consumption and holding herds on natural forage, Producers gambled that they could keep their cattle alive in economic suspended animation until the September deadline, when federal price controls were scheduled to expire. Holding cattle on pasture effectively broke the established cadence of the entire food supply chain. By substituting natural pasture grass for costly feed corn, agricultural operators managed to slash daily cash outlays while simultaneously halting the flow of beef to domestic food distributors. Executing this holding strategy required aggressive management of land resources and water access. Ranchers stretched their grazing pastures to the absolute brink, shifting cattle from field to field in a desperate effort to buy time without buying grain. Yet holding heavy cattle past their ideal slaughter date created an insurmountable biological bottleneck. A steer is biologically optimized to reach peak muscle yield at approximately 1,100 pounds. Beyond that weight limit, extra feed does not build marketable meat. It deposits thick layers of low-value waste fat around the internal organs and beneath the hide, degrading the overall quality, grade, and market value of the carcass. Watching their prime cattle grow overly fat and heavy created an agonizing dilemma for ranching families. They knew that every additional week spent on pasture was actively destroying the carcass quality of their livestock, but selling those animals under existing price caps meant accepting immediate bankruptcy. This biological wall meant that time was rapidly running out for both the livestock producers on the range and the massive industrial processing facilities that relied on a continuous stream of uniform cattle. By late July 1973, the widespread withholding of livestock had starved the central processing pipeline of live cattle. Historic meatpacking plants in Omaha, Sioux City, and Kansas City stood eerily quiet, their vast wooden holding pens virtually empty. Processing floors engineered to harvest hundreds of animals per hour were forced down to less than 20% of their normal operating capacity as incoming livestock trucks simply vanished from the highways. This sudden stoppage of incoming supply crippled the thin margin economics of industrial meatpacking. Fixed facilities and heavy refrigeration costs made running partially empty plants financially impossible, forcing plant operators to eliminate work shifts and stall production lines. Plant managers reviewed daily delivery logs that documented an unprecedented collapse in livestock arrivals. Without enough cattle moving through the gates to justify keeping the refrigeration machinery running, facility after facility reached the physical limit of operations. In August 1973, the national meatpacking infrastructure collapsed under the strain. Over 80 major packing plants across North America padlocked their doors and shut down their slaughter lines. More than 30,000 specialized meat packers were abruptly laid off, leaving industrial agricultural towns without paychecks and completely cutting off the flow of fresh beef to regional grocery networks. The economic shock struck working-class families across the Midwest with immediate force. Plant workers and town tradespeople who depended on the meatpacking economy were left without income, stranded in a rural economy that had been brought to a total standstill by policy failure. With the nation's processing hub effectively paralyzed, the artificial supply shock spilled out of the empty stockyards and directly into urban consumer centers, setting off a wave of panic across the country. Supermarket meat counters across the United States emptied completely by early August 1973. Where stainless steel trays once held rows of marbled steaks and roasts, shoppers found bare porcelain shelves wiped clean by fear. Terrified consumers scrambled to panic buy whatever cuts remained, clearing out entire store inventories in hours. Deep chest freezers sold out at appliance centers nationwide as families desperately hoarded hundreds of pounds of meat, bracing for a prolonged national winter of food scarcity. While empty grocery shelves signaled a total breakdown in retail distribution, the underlying cause was not a lack of live animals, but an artificial policy lock. Retailers could not raise prices to tame surging demand, and wholesalers could not cover their costs under the rigid price caps. As consumer purchasing accelerated in a frenzy of panic, the price ceiling blocked the normal rationing mechanism of the market, forcing retail stores to ration by exhaustion rather than by price. To stretch depleted store inventories, grocery store managers instituted strict per-customer buying limits on pork, lamb, and processed luncheon meats. Clerks posted handwritten index cards over barren display cases, restricting shoppers to 2 packages of meat per visit. Behind the locked doors of store backrooms, regional meat buyers spent frantic hours on telephone lines trying to secure non-existent shipments from regional distribution hubs, only to find that packing houses had ceased all deliveries. With official commercial supply lines completely frozen, an extensive illegal black market emerged almost overnight. Cattle were traded directly between ranchers and wealthy city buyers or local custom butchers at prices far above federal caps. Uninspected side-door transactions took place under cover of darkness behind rural barns and private feedlots. Cash changed hands off the books as desperate consumers paid double or triple the legal ceiling price for whole sides of uninspected beef. For ordinary citizens who could not afford underground prices, the rise of custom butchering and illegal sales bred deep anger and distrust. Working families watched as affluent neighbors purchased entire steers straight from local farms, while average shoppers stood in long, demoralizing lines for scraps. A bitter sense of injustice spread through suburban neighborhoods where food security suddenly felt like an exclusive privilege reserved only for those with liquid cash and rural connections. This shadow trade demonstrated how fast federal price controls could drive essential commerce underground, yet it could not fulfill the massive dietary needs of an entire nation. As traditional beef channels vanished into informal networks, millions of everyday shoppers were forced to seek alternative sources of protein on standard supermarket shelves. Consumers turned en masse to pork, chicken, and fish, driving prices for alternative protein sources to record heights and spreading inflation across the entire food sector. Supermarket display cases for poultry and seafood were stripped bare within hours of opening. The sudden, overwhelming surge in demand sent the cost of chicken and pork soaring, effectively neutralizing the White House strategy to keep cost of living increases under control through targeted caps on beef. This rapid spillover across meat counters illustrated the classic economic mechanism of substitution when primary commodity channels are artificially blocked. When price controls suppress the market supply of one vital foodstuff, consumer demand does not disappear. It concentrates instantly on unmanaged alternatives. The resulting demand shock forced poultry and pork processors to bid up their own input costs, accelerating agricultural inflation across every major protein category in the country. Broiler chicken hatcheries and hog operations struggled to ramp up breeding production to match the unprecedented rush of retail orders. Feed supply companies reported immediate shortages of soybean meal and animal feed mixes as poultry farmers expanded their flocks at emergency speed. Meanwhile, municipal authorities and agricultural inspectors reported widespread market rumors of horse meat and illicit game entering wholesale distribution networks, forcing local health agencies to step up spot audits of meat processing facilities. As August 1973 drew to a close, intense political pressure mounted on President Nixon's cabinet to abandon beef price controls before the entire agricultural economy collapsed. Agricultural state governors, industry associations, and labor leaders warned Washington that the artificial freeze was destroying feedlots, starving processing facilities, and threatening long-term food production. The White House faced an unprecedented economic crisis created entirely by its own anti-inflation directives. Inside the administration, officials felt a profound sense of anxiety as the public mood curdled into open hostility toward federal policy. Cabinet members recognized that their attempt to shield American households from inflation had instead manufactured widespread scarcity and public embarrassment. Millions of citizens were furious at a bureaucracy that seemed completely disconnected from the basic mechanics of how food moves from Midwestern farms to dinner tables. With the food system buckling and public faith deteriorating, the debate over price controls shifted from economic theory to direct administrative conflict inside the executive branch. The impending deadline for the policy required top economic planners to confront the unintended consequences of their market intervention. Agriculture Secretary Earl Butz argued publicly against Treasury Secretary George Shultz, demanding an immediate end to price controls to restore free market pricing signals. In heated cabinet meetings and press briefings, Butz declared that top-down price caps were strangling the nation's agricultural engine. He pushed aggressively for an unhedged return to open pricing, warning that every day the freeze remained in effect guaranteed greater structural damage to the cattle industry. This sharp institutional divide highlighted the fundamental tension between anti-inflationary price management and real-world supply logistics. The Treasury Department prioritized short-term statistical price stability to manage national inflation metrics, while the Department of Agriculture focused on the physical realities of livestock production cycles. By ignoring the biological timeline required to raise livestock, government price caps had trapped ranchers in a financial vice that made holding cattle on feed the only rational decision. Internal memos circulated between the Cost of Living Council and the Department of Agriculture detailing the dangerous backlog building up on Western feedlots. USDA analysts presented emergency data showing that live cattle inventories were accumulating at historical extremes, warning that the commercial weight of held animals was growing far past standard slaughter specifications. Despite these technical warnings, administration policymakers delayed lifting the ceiling, hoping to avoid a political admission of policy failure. By early September 1973, feedlots across the High Plains held over 1 million head of overfed heavy cattle weighing between 1,300 and 1,500 pounds, far past their commercial prime. These animals had consumed immense quantities of expensive feed corn while standing motionless in crowded pens. Ranchers had delayed slaughter for months in anticipation of the price cap expiration, creating a massive biological dam of oversized steers waiting to flood the market. Feedlot operators watched with deep dread as their animals grew dangerously oversized and financially burdensome. Every extra week on feed burned through borrowed bank capital for high-priced grain while adding worthless fat to the steers. Ranchers knew that they were sitting on a ticking financial time bomb, trapped between mounting debt from record feed bills and the impending risk of a catastrophic market crash the moment those animals finally moved. This massive backlog of overweight cattle represented a ticking fuse under the American agricultural economy, waiting for the policy dam to break. As the scheduled expiration of the price freeze neared, the entire industry braced for the inevitable wave of livestock that would soon pour into country stockyards and processing plants. As held cattle stood stranded past their optimal market age, their bodies underwent severe metabolic degradation in crowded feedlots across the High Plains. Instead of putting on valuable muscle and lean marbling, the animals began accumulating thick layers of waste fat over their backs and ribs. Federal inspectors noted that cattle kept beyond 1,200 pounds were converting costly feed corn into unusable waste fat, dropping their official USDA carcass grades from prime or choice down to yield grade 4 or 5. While fat accumulation eroded the commercial grade of these heavy steers, feedlot financial models crumbled under the burden of maintenance feeding. The feed conversion ratio degraded exponentially, requiring operators to pour vast quantities of expensive grain into animals that were no longer gaining lean, marketable weight. Every additional day on pasture or in feedlot pens reduced the overall efficiency of the herd, turning working capital into worthless waste. This biological inefficiency meant that every additional pound gained by an overfed steer cost nearly double the feed input of a normal animal in its commercial prime. Ranchers were effectively burning borrowed capital to keep cattle alive, piling up massive daily feed bills while watching the quality, lean yield, and market value of their livestock steadily decay. On September 9, 1973, President Nixon was forced to concede defeat and issued an executive order, lifting all price controls on retail beef 2 days ahead of schedule. White House economic advisors realized that keeping the cap in place threatened a total failure of the national food supply, as meat processing had ground to a virtual halt across America, while live cattle piled up on farms. The sudden removal of price ceilings brought no immediate relief to anxious consumers or struggling agricultural workers, but rather a profound sense of looming panic. Ranchers and feedlot owners, desperate to salvage what little equity remained after months of mounting debt, prepared to unload their backed-up cattle onto a fragile and highly volatile market. With the regulatory barrier officially dismantled, the artificial hold on livestock dissolved overnight, opening the floodgates for millions of heavy cattle across the country. The cattle industry shifted instantly from a state of total paralysis to a frantic, uncoordinated rush toward regional sale barns, stockyards, and meat-packing hubs. On September 10, 1973, a staggering tidal wave of long-held livestock hit major stockyards in Omaha, Kansas City, and Chicago. Hundreds of thousands of over-fat cattle swamped unloading docks, quickly filling holding pens to capacity and spilling out into alleyways. The sudden influx completely overwhelmed stockyard logistics crews, leaving thousands of heavy steers waiting for hours in crowded pens without adequate water or feed. This massive dump of live animals instantly inverted the market dynamic from extreme retail scarcity to an overwhelming structural surplus at the wholesale level. Meatpacking plants that had stood idle or operated at partial capacity just days earlier were suddenly buried under an unmanageable volume of oversized cattle that far exceeded their daily slaughtering capacity. Logistical bottlenecks worsened rapidly as independent trucking companies struggled to move the unprecedented volume of livestock from High Plains feedlots to slaughter facilities. Processing yards were forced to implement emergency scheduling protocols, turning away long queues of cattle trucks at the gate as holding pens reached total physical capacity. Slaughterhouses quickly encountered severe operational bottlenecks trying to process the oversized steers flooding their facilities. Processing lines designed for standard 1,100-pound cattle slowed down dramatically as line workers wrestled with massive 1,500-pound carcasses, causing meat packers to abruptly pull back from the market and stop submitting buying bids. For feedlot owners who had held their cattle through months of strict price controls, the sudden collapse of packer bids felt like a devastating betrayal. Ranchers watched in quiet horror as animals they had spent small fortunes feeding sat stranded in stockyard pens, losing weight and market value by the hour while packing plant managers refused to negotiate purchases. As slaughterhouse doors slammed shut against the deluge of livestock, the anxiety that had haunted feedlot operators turned into a full-scale market panic. The hidden financial pressures that had been building behind government price caps erupted across commodity trading floors, setting off a swift and violent repricing of live cattle. Spot prices for live cattle plummeted immediately, cratering from a peak of over $56 per hundredweight down to under $38 within a matter of weeks. On the floor of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, live cattle futures crashed day after day, repeatedly hitting limit-down thresholds as panicked speculators and hedgers rushed to liquidate long positions. The sudden price collapse completely shattered the financial calculations of feedlot operators who had held back stock in anticipation of a post-freeze windfall. Instead of realizing higher prices to offset their inflated grain bills, ranchers were forced to sell their overfed cattle at massive, ruinous discounts into a thoroughly saturated market. Commodity brokers on the exchange floor executed frantic sell orders into a void of buyers, triggering automated margin calls that wiped out equity accounts across the agricultural sector. Feedlot owners were forced to liquidate cattle at whatever price buyers offered simply to satisfy immediate repayment demands from nervous agricultural lenders. Adding to the financial ruin, meat packers instituted severe price penalties known as yield-grade deductions on overfat steers arriving at processing plants. Buyers heavily discounted these patchy, overfinished cattle because trimming away pounds of excess waste fat increased packing labor costs and drastically reduced the percentage of high-value saleable meat. The harsh yield grade penalties dealt a crushing blow to independent cattle producers across the rural Midwest and High Plains. Ranchers who had poured their life savings into expensive feed corn were punished twice over, receiving bottom-tier market prices for animals that packers now dismissed as structurally defective and financially unprofitable. The double disaster of collapsing cash market prices and severe carcass deductions left the cattle feeding industry deeply traumatized and financially drained. As the dust settled over flooded stockyards, the catastrophic financial losses incurred during the autumn of 1973 began pushing hundreds of independent feedlots toward inevitable insolvency. By late 1973 and early 1974, the severe financial fallout swept through rural communities across the High Plains. Hundreds of independent, family-owned feedlots faced complete financial ruin. These operators could no longer service the short-term operating credit lines that kept their pens filled and their feed bins stocked. What began as a government price freeze had officially destroyed their balance sheets. While those independent yards crumbled under debt, the credit system itself locked up tight. Regional agricultural lenders stopped rolling over seasonal loans when cattle values dropped far below loan balances. The rapid loss of equity meant feedlot owners were forced to liquidate their remaining livestock into a crashing market, locking in devastating paper losses as permanent cash realities. To cover unpaid feed bills and compounding bank interest, operators sold off land, heavy machinery, and equipment at fire sale prices. Feedlot pens that once fed thousands of cattle stood silent and empty across the countryside. The cash flow that sustained small rural towns across Kansas, Nebraska, and Iowa vanished almost overnight as local farm account balances plummeted toward zero. Production credit associations and local agricultural banks moved quickly to limit their own financial exposure, initiating foreclosure proceedings against bankrupt feedlots. Foreclosure notices were pinned to barn doors as lenders seized cattle herds, farm equipment, and land titles to cover defaulted loans. The collateral holding up rural credit markets had fundamentally collapsed under the weight of intervention. For families who had worked the same land for generations, these bank seizures ended decades of independent cattle raising. Decades of hard work and careful stewardship dissolved under legal notices and public court auctions. The psychological blow across rural farming towns was swift and severe, leaving long-standing farm families financially stripped of their traditional livelihoods. As bank sales emptied out bankrupt operations across the Farm Belt, the financial devastation spread further back along the supply line. The collapse of feedlot buying power hit the foundational tier of American cattle production, sending economic shockwaves directly into the herds of Western cow-calf ranches that supplied the entire industry. The financial crash forced cow-calf producers to make drastic decisions, liquidating their core breeding herds just to satisfy immediate debt demands. Ranchers sent mature brood cows to slaughterhouses in record numbers. By shrinking the national mother cow herd, producers unknowingly created a structural deficit in beef production that would take nearly a decade to rebuild. This mass slaughter of breeding stock severely disrupted the 1974 calf crop, cutting the future supply of young feeder cattle across the country. Biological cycles cannot be rushed or skipped by policy directives. Without young calves entering the pipeline, future meat supplies were guaranteed to remain dangerously thin, ensuring elevated wholesale prices long after price caps disappeared. Ranchers sold off young heifers normally kept for herd replacement, taking immediate cash discounts at regional auction yards rather than risking future feed expenses. Auction barns across Texas, Oklahoma, and Colorado handled millions of breeding animals sold at distressed prices. The fundamental building blocks of future American beef production were dismantled in a matter of months, as independent operators faced bankruptcy throughout early 1974. Well-capitalized corporate agribusinesses stepped into the void. Industrial conglomerates bought distressed feedlots and prime land for pennies on the dollar. Record filings at the United States Department of Agriculture documented a massive transfer of agricultural assets from independent family hands into corporate entities. Local control over cattle production vanished almost overnight across the Great Plains. Multi-generational farming families watched outside corporate executives arrive with clipboards to take ownership of their ancestral pens and pastures. The deep personal connection between rural communities and the land was systematically replaced by distant corporate managers reporting directly to corporate boardrooms. This corporate takeover of rural feeding infrastructure paved the way for a complete overhaul of American meat processing. With traditional independent cattle feeders eliminated from the market, massive corporate firms moved in quickly to establish a unified, hyper-efficient industrial packing model that would dominate the nation for decades. Companies like Iowa Beef Processors, known as IBP, exploited the industry crisis to completely transform the meatpacking landscape. They bypassed traditional central livestock yards in major cities like Chicago and Omaha. Instead, IBP built modern, highly automated packing plants right in rural areas, leveraging non-union labor to severely undercut legacy competitors. The IBP model replaced skilled union butchers with streamlined assembly lines where workers performed single, repeated cuts. Operating at tremendous volume right near corporate feedlots drastically reduced animal transportation costs and livestock weight loss during transit. This operational efficiency allowed IBP to dictate pricing terms across the entire beef supply chain. By placing processing plants adjacent to massive rural feeding operations, IBP established direct delivery lines for live cattle. Animals moved continuously from heavy feed pens straight into slaughter facilities without public auctions or commission agents. The traditional open bidding market for live cattle was effectively replaced by direct corporate procurement contracts. IBP pioneered the revolutionary concept of boxed beef, carving whole carcasses into vacuum-sealed wholesale cuts directly on the factory floor. Internal USDA records from 1974 show boxed beef shipments surging as IBP eliminated the need for shipping full carcasses to local butchers. This shift permanently centralized market power within a handful of mega processors. The rapid spread of boxed beef decimated thousands of traditional neighborhood butcher shops and urban packing houses. Skilled butchers who had spent lifetimes mastering their trade saw their roles eliminated by automated processing plants. The traditional craft of meat cutting was replaced by industrial disassembly, permanently altering how meat reached American dinner tables. This shift toward boxed beef marked the final consolidation of the modern meat industry. What began as a White House effort to cap grocery prices had permanently reshaped American agriculture, forcing the entire industry into an era of centralized corporate contracts, direct integration, and overwhelming institutional scale. To guard against future policy shocks, the feedlot operators who survived the crash turned to new financial shields. They stopped relying on spot market auctions and began embracing formula pricing tied directly to futures contracts on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. On trading floors and in corporate offices, financial hedging transformed from a speculative luxury into an absolute requirement for survival. Managing price risk became just as vital to their operation as feeding cattle. These sophisticated hedging tools allowed massive feedlots to lock in profits months before cattle ever reached slaughter weight. By tying live cattle futures to grain costs in advance, large operations could insulate themselves from sudden regulatory swings. Independent family farms, lacking the capital and institutional access to trade complex derivatives, were left completely exposed to spot market volatility. Major packing plants capitalized on this shift by offering long-term forward contracts directly to mega feedlots. These agreements guaranteed a steady supply of cattle at predetermined price formulas, effectively bypassing the traditional auction yard. In exchange, feedlots agreed to supply precise volumes of livestock on strict schedules, binding agricultural producers directly to meatpacking conglomerates. The collapse of 1973 remains a classic case study in regulatory lag and the failure of central economic planning within dynamic commodity markets. When government bureaucrats attempt to fix market prices, their decisions move at the slow pace of administrative committees, while real-world trade moves instantly. The price freeze created an artificial barrier that completely derailed the natural balance of agricultural supply chains. For thousands of rural families, the tragedy was watching decades of hard work erased by policy decisions made hundreds of miles away in Washington. Independent ranchers who had weathered droughts, blizzards, and market cycles were ruined not by nature, but by government mandates. The realization that political panic had destroyed their family legacies left a deep, lasting bitterness across America's heartland. This widespread devastation highlighted how central planning breaks down when forced onto complex agricultural markets. To understand why the policy failure was so complete, one must examine the fundamental flaw engineered directly into the structure of the Phase 3 economic program. The core flaw of Nixon's Phase 3 policy was its attempt to cap end consumer prices while leaving underlying input commodity markets free to fluctuate. The administration capped the final retail price of beef at the grocery counter, but left feed, corn, fuel, labor, and transport unrestricted. Input costs were free to climb as high as global demand pushed them. This asymmetric design created an unsustainable economic squeeze on every link of the supply chain. Feedlots were forced to purchase feed corn at soaring world market prices while being legally forbidden from passing those increased expenses onto packers or consumers. The math became toxic, making every additional day a steer spent eating high-priced grain a direct financial loss for the producer. Internal documents from the Cost of Living Council reveal that policy planners foolishly assumed grain prices would naturally stabilize on their own. They failed to account for foreign grain sales, adverse weather, or global trade demand that kept corn prices climbing throughout the summer. By focusing entirely on short-term political optics at the grocery counter, regulators overlooked the basic cost accounting required to keep feedlots operating. When retail price ceilings severed the connection between consumer demand and wholesale production, essential economic price signals were silenced. Capped retail prices stopped reflecting the true scarcity of beef, preventing the natural price adjustments that keep goods moving through supply channels. Consumers continued searching for cheap meat, completely unaware that the production engine behind it had ground to a halt. Frustrated shoppers stood before empty, cold display cases in grocery stores across the nation, unable to purchase food even when they were willing to pay higher prices. Supermarket managers were forced to explain that their suppliers simply had no meat to ship at the legally mandated ceiling price. The policy created an infuriating paradox where consumer demand was high, yet meat counters remained totally barren. As these broken price signals threw food distribution into nationwide chaos, the agricultural sector was hit by yet another massive economic shock from outside the country. The late 1973 OPEC oil embargo struck the global economy, quadrupling crude oil prices almost overnight and spiking the price of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. Agriculture, heavily dependent on petroleum fuel and chemical inputs, faced an unprecedented jump in production expenses. The cost of running heavy machinery and fertilizing cornfields surged to historic highs. This sudden rise in energy costs made growing feed corn permanently more expensive for farmers. Higher diesel prices raised the cost of planting, harvesting, and trucking grain to feedlots, while elevated fertilizer prices squeezed crop profit margins. What had started as a temporary government price freeze now collided with a permanent structural inflation spike across all agricultural inputs. Natural gas shortages directly disrupted chemical plants, cutting fertilizer manufacturing capacity just as spring planting season approached. Farmers were forced to pay double or triple for essential nitrogen inputs, which directly raised the break-even cost for producing every bushel of feed corn. These elevated grain production costs locked high feed expenses into the livestock industry for years to come. The sustained high cost of beef production permanently altered American eating habits, accelerating a long-term consumer shift away from beef toward lower-cost poultry. As retail beef prices remained elevated throughout the middle of the decade, budget-conscious households altered their daily meal planning. Industrial chicken, which was far cheaper and more efficient to produce, quickly filled the void on American dinner plates. The affordable beef dinner, long celebrated as a fundamental symbol of middle-class American prosperity, was suddenly out of reach for millions of working families. Giving up a familiar staple felt like a quiet, painful decline in their daily standard of living. For many households, grocery shopping transformed from a routine task into a stressful balancing act against relentless food inflation. This permanent shift in consumer habits forced cattle producers to accept a harsh new economic reality. The era of cheap grain, informal credit, and easy profits was gone forever, setting the stage for a complete structural transformation of Western ranching. Across the open plains of Wyoming and Texas, the independent ranching tradition was forced into a permanent surrender. The financial carnage of 1973 made it clear that small-scale pasture operators could no longer survive alone against sudden market swings. To avoid total ruin, ranchers abandoned traditional independence, entering into tight contract partnerships with massive corporate feedlots and packing processors to guarantee their basic operating income. While these corporate contracts saved ranching operations from immediate collapse, they stripped away the freedom to choose when to market livestock. The new industrial system required cattle producers to deliver animals on strict schedules dictated by corporate processing plants rather than local market conditions. Independent cow-calf operators became contract suppliers in a tightly coordinated assembly line, permanently sacrificing their traditional independence for minimal financial security. Under this integrated system, legal agreements locked in purchase prices months before cattle ever reached market weight. Ranchers surrendered control over feeding practices, health management, and sale timing to institutional buyers who financed the ongoing operation. By tying local pasture production directly to massive corporate slaughter schedules, the American agricultural landscape moved rapidly from open auctions to centralized corporate planning. Economists analyzing the 1973 crisis later calculated the immense structural damage caused by artificial price caps across the economy. Government statistical analyses proved that capping retail prices created a massive deadweight economic loss, wasting millions of tons of feed corn on overfattened cattle that lost market value every single day. This wasted feed translated into billions of dollars in lost agricultural productivity and destroyed real economic wealth. Beyond the cold mathematical calculations lay the agonizing reality for thousands of farm families whose lifetime savings evaporated in a single season. Watching years of relentless physical labor dissolve into overwhelming debt created a profound sense of powerlessness across rural communities. The sudden destruction of their livelihoods proved that bureaucratic mistakes in distant government offices could wipe out multi-generational family farms in a matter of weeks. Although academic studies later documented the full extent of this economic damage, the immediate political fallout was already moving rapidly through Washington during the autumn of 1973. Treasury Department records from late 1973 show that federal officials were desperate to deflect public outrage away from policy mistakes as broad inflation continued to accelerate across every sector of the American economy. Inside the White House, the beef crisis erupted at the worst possible moment for President Richard Nixon. As the Watergate scandal deepened throughout 1973, empty grocery counters destroyed the administration's claims of economic competence and managerial control. Citizens who were already skeptical of government authority saw the sudden meat shortage as clear proof that federal planners could not even manage the national food supply. While White House officials publicly blamed corporate greed and rancher hoarding, internal administration memos revealed that political leaders understood the regulatory trap they had created. Capping retail prices while feed costs rose had created a structural bottleneck that no amount of political spin could fix. The administration's refusal to admit policy errors destroyed public trust, turning an agricultural market distortion into a major political scandal. Congressional committee hearings held in late 1973 documented how top-level political decisions repeatedly overrode explicit warnings from agricultural experts. Transcripts showed that cost of living council officials ignored clear market data, choosing temporary price caps over long-term stability. The resulting supply collapse forced policymakers to abandon price controls entirely, ending Phase 3 in political embarrassment and administrative failure. The 1973 shortage exposed a fundamental mistake in federal economic policy: confusing price rises caused by high input costs with price rises caused by excess consumer demand. Department of Agriculture reports from 1974 confirmed that capping retail prices could never stop inflation when raw grain and fuel costs were soaring. Forcing store prices down while production costs rose simply halted production entirely, proving that price controls cannot overrule cost reality. For ordinary consumers standing before empty store displays, the economic policy debate mattered far less than the daily reality of food scarcity. The humiliating experience of waiting in long lines for basic food items left lasting psychological scars on American households. Trust in federal authority vanished as families realized that government intervention had turned basic grocery shopping into an unpredictable struggle for survival. This painful lesson in price mechanics quickly repeated itself beyond the grocery counter as energy markets broke down under similar price regulations later that same year. By late 1973, federal energy administrators faced the exact same structural failures that had emptied meat counters across the country just months earlier. The nationwide lines at gas stations during the 1973 oil crisis mirrored the empty meat counters of that summer. Just as price caps on retail beef created an artificial meat shortage, statutory caps on domestic oil prices led to long lines at filling stations across the country. Consumers found themselves trapped in a secondary supply crisis driven by identical regulatory mistakes and policy blunders. In both food and energy markets, fixing end consumer prices while raw input costs floated freely triggered immediate supply hoarding and market panic. Refineries like beef slaughterhouses found it impossible to process raw materials at a profit under federal price caps. The resulting fuel shortages demonstrated that capping retail prices in a complex production network guarantees widespread shortages rather than affordability. Federal Energy Office directives from late 1973 created complex allocation formulas that failed to deliver fuel to where consumer demand was highest. Station owners received fixed monthly fuel quotas regardless of local needs, forcing drivers to queue for hours or face locked pumps. The administrative chaos in energy distribution matched the exact policy failures that had crippled cattle yards earlier that year. The aftermath of the 1973 crisis accelerated a massive wave of corporate consolidation, creating the modern industrial meat landscape dominated by just 4 massive processors. Recent Department of Agriculture data reveals that 4 corporate giants, Tyson, JBS, Cargill, and Marfrig, now control over 85% of all steer and heifer slaughter processing capacity in the United States. A market once defined by thousands of independent operators became highly concentrated. This extreme concentration of market power left cattle producers with virtually no bargaining leverage against 4 massive corporate buyers. Ranchers who once took pride in setting their own prices at open auctions now found themselves completely dependent on terms dictated by meatpacking giants. The loss of market independence felt like a quiet tragedy to rural communities that had spent generations building independent livestock operations. While this consolidated meatpacking system created immense scale efficiency and corporate profits, it also built a highly fragile supply chain vulnerable to sudden, unexpected disruptions. The structural centralization that began during the 1973 crisis created hidden systemic risks that would re-emerge decades later during modern economic panics and global supply shocks. Modern food networks move on razor-thin schedules where every truck, feedlot, and processing plant depends on accurate prices to stay afloat. In a hyperlean system, supplies do not sit in reserve waiting for political promises. Everything moves continuously from farm to market based on simple calculations of daily cost and expected return. When a sudden policy shift disrupts those calculations, the entire physical chain stalls instantly. When pricing signals fail, every business in the supply chain naturally acts to protect itself from guaranteed losses. A feedlot manager holding thousands of animals cannot simply absorb escalating feed expenses while selling at a fixed ceiling. The rational choice for the individual owner becomes a catastrophic breakdown for the collective market. Each link in the chain holds back, hoping the bottleneck breaks before their operational cash runs completely dry. Modern logistics depend on precise contract timing to deliver fresh goods across thousands of miles without spoilage or waste. When market freezes interrupt those contracts, storage facilities overflow, while store shelves clear out in a matter of days. Distributors are left holding orders they cannot fulfill, unable to legally pass increased transportation costs down the line. What looks like corporate stubbornness from the outside is actually a mathematical survival tactic executed across thousands of independent businesses. The painful aftermath of the 1973 beef freeze became a permanent case study in the danger of using legal price caps to battle inflation. Economists and policy experts still point to that summer whenever governments attempt to fix consumer prices during sudden economic spikes. Setting a rigid maximum price on a commodity never reduces the actual cost of producing it. Instead, it simply hides the real cost until the underlying pressure shatters the supply network entirely. For working families standing in front of empty grocery displays, the legal price cap offered no protection at all. A legal ceiling on meat meant nothing when there was no meat left on the shelf to purchase. Millions of consumers realized that an affordable official price is meaningless if the product itself ceases to exist. The public frustration grew from a deep sense that top-down economic promises had robbed them of basic daily stability. The lessons of 1973 echo far beyond the cattle feedlots of the American Midwest. Decades after the Nixon administration lifted its emergency mandates, the fundamental tension between government price mandates and market reality remains unresolved. Whenever inflation threatens political leaders, the temptation to cap essential goods resurfaces in public debate. Yet history demonstrates that suppressing prices without addressing underlying supply costs creates far worse disasters than the inflation it tries to solve. In recent years, government attempts to cap energy and food costs across global markets have triggered strikingly similar disruptions, from state-enforced fuel caps in developing nations to price limits on staple grains during international crises. Administrative intervention repeatedly fractures real-world distribution. Processing plants scale back production, global shipping routes shift to unregulated markets, and local shortages quickly follow official declarations. The mechanics behind these modern disruptions mirror the exact dynamics that paralyzed American agriculture in 1973. When an official policy forces businesses to sell goods below the true market cost of production, capital flees the regulated sector immediately. Producers either halt operations entirely or seek legal loopholes to export their goods elsewhere. The intervention intended to protect consumers ultimately starves the domestic market of the very supplies people need to survive. When modern governments enact emergency price ceilings on grain or fuel, suppliers adjust their shipping routes within hours. Ships carrying essential commodities divert away from ports, enforcing price caps toward open markets where buyers pay full value. Customs records and trade filings repeatedly show how regulatory barriers turn domestic shortages into prolonged crises while surrounding regions maintain steady supplies. The ultimate outcome of the 1973 crisis was a total redesign of the American food supply system toward central corporate control. The independent family farmers and regional meat packers who could not withstand months of artificial price freezes were systematically wiped out. In their place, massive integrated agricultural corporations took ownership of every stage from animal feed production to supermarket delivery. This permanent industrial shift altered the power balance across rural America for generations. Federal agricultural legislation following the crisis favored large-scale corporate consolidation that could absorb political shocks and hedging risks. The diverse, decentralized farming economy of the mid-20th century was permanently replaced by an ultra-efficient, highly concentrated industrial architecture. Behind the macroeconomic charts and legislative records were thousands of farming families who lost businesses built over generations. Ranchers who had survived severe droughts and market crashes were forced into foreclosure by a single summer of well-intentioned White House policy decisions. The loss went far beyond personal finance, tearing at the cultural identity of rural communities across the heartland. Small-town banks and livestock auctions that had anchored local communities for decades quietly shut their doors in the months that followed. The young people who saw their parents lose everything during the 1973 freeze abandoned rural agriculture in droves, seeking corporate jobs in urban centers. A way of life that had defined Middle America for over a century lost its foundation in a matter of months. By early 1974, official congressional hearings and Department of Agriculture reports confirmed what producers had warned from the beginning. Government records documented that Phase 3 price controls had directly caused the artificial scarcity, cost-push inflation, and widespread bankruptcies of 1973. The findings forced policymakers to abandon general wage and price controls as a viable tool for peacetime economic management. The institutional memory of the 1973 beef freeze reshaped American economic doctrine for the rest of the 20th century. Central planners and Treasury officials learned that live agricultural commodities cannot be managed like factory production lines. The crisis fundamentally changed how federal agencies approached food security, shifting focus from price intervention to income subsidies and crop insurance programs. Yet one central question remains unanswered in the historical record of the 1973 crisis. Scholars and market analysts still debate whether administration officials genuinely failed to understand basic livestock biology or whether they willingly sacrificed independent cattle producers to score a short-term political victory against inflation. Official White House tapes from the period capture tense debates but leave the core intent obscured behind political rhetoric. The precise boundary between well-intentioned bureaucratic ignorance and calculated political strategy remains buried in archived White House memos. What is undeniable is that executive decision-makers were repeatedly warned by field experts at the Department of Agriculture about the upcoming disaster weeks before the meat counters went completely empty. Whether those warnings were ignored out of hubris or political desperation remains a haunting question. The legacy of 1973 stands as a stark monument to the dangerous power of misaligned economic incentives. When policy ignores the physical reality of how goods are produced and priced, no amount of executive authority can force a broken system to deliver. The empty meat counters of 1973 revealed that when government regulations clash with fundamental market incentives, the economic machine does not adapt, it simply breaks. The legal fallout of the 1973 crisis led directly to the passage of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission Act of 1974. Congress realized that the old regulatory framework could not track real-time price distortions between cash markets and futures contracts during government intervention. By establishing a dedicated federal watchdog with sweeping emergency powers, lawmakers hoped to prevent future price freezes from paralyzing vital agricultural markets. Yet the fundamental lesson remained carved into law. Fixing prices at the retail counter without controlling raw material costs will always shatter the supply chain. In small rural counties across Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas, the human toll recorded in auction logs was devastating. Over 4,000 independent livestock operations went into liquidation in the 18 months following the lifting of Phase 3 caps. Local bankers who had financed generations of cattle herds were forced to sign foreclosure papers on families they had known for decades. These were not speculative corporate entities, but family farms where decisions were made around kitchen tables, ruined by a policy blueprint drafted thousands of miles away in Washington. The displacement wiped out decades of built-up equity in rural communities. As young farmers abandoned the land for factory jobs in Midwestern cities, local schools merged, small-town Main Street saw their storefronts boarded up, and whole agricultural districts permanently lost their young working population. The economic shockwave did not end when meat returned to grocery shelves. It reshaped the social fabric of the American heartland for a generation. That structural collapse permanently shifted the balance of power within American food production. Prior to 1973, independent ranchers and local feedlots controlled more than 60% of the nation's market-ready beef. Within 10 years of the price freeze, 4 massive corporate processors took control of the vast majority of slaughterhouse capacity across the country. The crisis accelerated a transition from decentralized, family-owned farming to highly concentrated corporate integration, forever changing how food reaches the American table. This consolidation also fundamentally changed Washington's approach to economic management. The absolute failure of top-down price controls in 1973 destroyed the political credibility of peacetime wage and price freezes in the United States. For the past 50 years, fiscal and monetary authorities have consistently cited the 1973 beef shortage as a textbook warning against direct government intervention in commodity pricing, preferring interest rate adjustments over direct market caps. Yet an unsettling question lingers in modern commodity markets. As contemporary supply chains become ever more complex and reliant on automated just-in-time logistics, could a similar policy miscalculation trigger another sudden freeze in basic consumer goods? Today's algorithms optimize margins on paper-thin buffers, meaning even minor regulatory mismatches can snowball into immediate catastrophic supply chain failures before central planners even realize a disruption has begun. The official records leave us wondering where human error ended and administrative hubris began during those critical weeks in the summer of 1973. Did the architects of Phase 3 truly believe that economic laws would yield to political authority, or did they simply assume the burden would fall on powerless rural producers rather than urban voters? History preserves the policy documents and the White House recordings, but the true depth of that miscalculation remains open to debate. What is certain is that the physical mechanics of the livestock production cycle refuse to bend to bureaucratic mandates. A cow cannot be rushed to market on a politician's schedule, nor can a feeder steer be fattened without expensive corn. When government policy tried to break those simple biological and economic facts, the market responded according to its own unyielding rules, proving that incentive structures will always dictate human behavior over executive decree. The resulting shift permanently altered consumer habits across the Western world. Faced with skyrocketing beef prices once caps were lifted, millions of American households permanently shifted a portion of their daily diet toward cheaper poultry and pork products, fundamentally altering meat consumption patterns for the rest of the 20th century. The temporary price cap designed to protect cheap beef ended up permanently reducing its dominance on the dinner plate. Across the High Plains today, you can still find the quiet remnants of that economic earthquake. Crumbling wooden loading chutes and overgrown fencing stand empty along rural county roads, marking places where independent herds once grazed before the summer of 1973. These weathered structures are forgotten monuments to thousands of ranching families who were quietly swept off their land when the math of survival no longer added up. Inside dusty county courthouses, tax ledgers from late 1973 and 1974 capture the silent transfer of property titles from individuals to corporate land holdings. The names on those old deeds changed in a matter of months, marking a quiet migration that forever altered rural America. The physical landscape adapted to giant industrialized feedlots, leaving the old family operations behind in the dirt. The 1973 beef crisis stands as a masterclass in unintended economic consequences. It revealed how a well-meaning policy aimed at suppressing inflation can inadvertently cause the exact disaster it was designed to prevent. When central authorities cap prices without accounting for input costs, they do not make goods affordable, they make goods vanish. In the cold logic of global commerce, market incentives are as unforgiving as gravity. When the rules of the game make production unprofitable, production stops, regardless of consumer demand or political willpower. The machinery of trade does not operate on hope or executive authority. It operates on profit, loss, and the absolute reality of human self-interest. Standing on a quiet feedlot hill in Kansas, all that remains of that turbulent summer is the hollow metallic creak of a rusted iron gate swinging loose in the prairie wind.